Welcome back to another edition of RotoBallers Start 'em and Sit 'em. Let's review some critical fantasy matchups across the league and break down some of my favorite starts and sits. As we enter week number 5 of the NFL season, so do the bye weeks. That means fantasy managers will be looking for replacements for David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, J.K. Dobbins, Saquon Barkley, and I guess Tony Pollard, as the Detroit Lions, Los Angeles Chargers, Philadelphia Eagles, and the Tennessee Titans all have their byes this week. You heard the names, so let's get to those week 5 starts and sits at the running back position. Starting with those starts and starting with DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears as they take on the Carolina Panthers. Did we finally get that DeAndre Swift breakout game, or are we simply chasing points? Only time and the Carolina Panthers will tell. Last week, Swift had the best game to date for this Bears team. As fantasy managers contemplated throwing him back into the waiver wire, he totally redeemed himself in a matchup against the Rams, who were the 6th most favorable matchup to opposing backs in fantasy. Swift ran for 93 yards on 16 attempts and a score. He also had 7 receptions for 72 yards. If not for Derrick Henry's 200-yard performance against the Bills, Swift would be your running back 1 for the week. This week, the matchup, it is even better as the Bears host the Carolina Panthers team, who have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points this season to running backs at a clip of 28.6 fantasy points per game. With the Bears' weapons on offense, it's unlikely that Swift is going to see a 32% target share again this week, but that 62% of the team route run rate there, along with that 67% snap share, along with another 62% of the running backs' attempts out of the backfield, that is promising. The next running back I'm going to talk about, I'm going to stick with this Panthers-Bears matchup as well, and it is Chuba Hubbard. As bad as the Panthers have been at defending the run, the Chicago Bears, they haven't been any better. In fact, they are allowing just over 22 fantasy points per game to the position, making themselves a top 10 matchup as well. Since Andy Dalton took over under center, Chuba Hubbard has totaled 218 total yards here on the ground and 77 additional yards in the passing game, along with a pair of scores. Dalton has his offense playing at another level altogether and producing. Chuba Hubbard, meanwhile, he looks like a back who has zero intentions of handing the starting role back to Jonathan Brooks when he comes back. Now, we want to see workhorse backs in fantasy, and over the last 2 contests, Hubbard has accounted for 75% of Carolina's rushing attempts. Hubbard's newfound production, it has come after seeing just 49% of those touches out of the backfield through the first 2 weeks. That is why he's produced at least 22 fantasy points in back-to-back weeks. And my third start of the week, it is Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers as they take on the Los Angeles Rams. Now I'm starting to think that I have a love-hate type relationship when it comes to Josh Jacobs at this point. Now, maybe I'm a scorn lover, and that is perfectly a reasonable thing to believe. With my Raiders fan, I'm showing up from time to time. But Jacobs, he looks like he's a matchup-based starter for fantasy. Let's look at those numbers and make sure maybe I'm not a crazy X when it comes to Jacobs' production. Jacobs is an RB3 on a points-per-game basis so far this season. 10.8 fantasy points per game. He trails the likes of Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, and the aforementioned Chuba Hubbard, just to name a few. Jacobs, he is coming off of back-to-back weeks in which he failed to rush for more than 55 yards after running roughshod against the Colts team back in week 2 for 151 yards on the ground. Maybe more alarming for fantasy managers is the emergence of Emmanuel Wilson, who is becoming a real problem, accounting for 41% of the snaps and 36% of the attempts over the last 2 weeks. Now, the good news is, it may not matter this week as he faces that Rams defense that has allowed on average 24.1 fantasy points per game to the position, which is the 6th most in the league. And we just saw Brian Robinson and Jeremy McNichols. Yes, Jeremy McNichols. And I know that nobody actually knew he was with the Washington Commanders here. They combined for 179 yards on the ground and 3 scores. Now, a few other backs here that have great matchups this week. Derrick Henry and, yes, Justice Hill against the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Mixon as the Texans host the Buffalo Bills. And Jordan Mason of the 49ers, they welcome the Arizona Cardinals to San Francisco. Now, how about those week 5 running backs that I am sitting because they have bust potential? How about Brian Robinson against the Cleveland Browns? Now, I'm trying to determine right now if the Browns defense is one to avoid or if the numbers look impressive due to poor competition. In week 1, Ezekiel Elliott, he had just 40 yards rushing, but he did manage to find the end zone. Then in week number 2, they held Travis Etienne to 52 yards on the ground, but he too found his way to pay dirt. Week number 3, you guessed it, another strong performance against Devin Singletary, holding him to 65 yards and a score. Then, last week against Zamir White, he is the one running back who did fail to score, but he hasn't done a whole lot of scoring at any point this season. So, I don't know what to make of this so far. There are going to be better matchups out there than Robinson versus the Cleveland Browns this week. And I think you can afford to sit Robinson against a Browns defense. Despite the touchdowns, they are allowing just the 9th fewest fantasy points so far this season. My prediction for Robinson Jr., how about a rushing touchdown and 67 yards on the ground? That is respectable as long as Jeremy McNichols doesn't try to play the hero once again. Another running back that I'm sitting, Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as they take on the Atlanta Falcons. It's not like White was terrible last week. He averaged 4.9 yards per carry while hauling in a couple passes there against the Philadelphia Eagles. The problem is he had 10 carries for 49 yards, which is the same production as Bucky Irvin, who also had 10 carries for 49 yards and a touchdown. It's not just a touchdown that he got a touchdown, got a call back from a penalty, and then he got the touchdown again. Tampa Bay's backfield is as divided as they come in the NFL. Not only were the carries evenly split, but Irving saw one fewer target than Rachaad White, who is supposed to be the promised one when it comes to pass catching ability out of this Buccaneers backfield. This week, the Buccaneers, they take on an Atlanta team who rank inside the top 5 in terms of fantasy points surrendered to the running back position, allowing just 14.2 per contest. I'm not great at math, but if I take this and split it down the middle, that is about 7.1 fantasy points coming for Rachaad White, and that's not going to cut it. And my final sit of the week, listen, there's no way that you're actually going to sit Breece Hall, especially with 4 teams on a bye. Is there? Well, he kind of makes my sit list. When it comes to these international games, I try my best to avoid them. It's bad enough when West Coast teams historically struggle when they travel to the East Coast, but the NFL teams, when they're asked to cross the pond, it hasn't necessarily been a showcase of our best talent. Now, I expect both these offenses to look sluggish out of the gate, especially facing 2 of the top defenses in the NFL when it comes to limiting fantasy production for the running back position. Breece Hall faces a Vikings defensive unit that has allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points this season to the position at just 13.6 per contest. Typically, Hall could handle whatever competition you throw at him, but I just watched a Denver Broncos team hold Hall to just 4 yards on 10 carries a week ago. With a team that likes to blitz as much as the Vikings, maybe Hall could be a factor in the passing game if he can haul in more than 2 passes for 14 yards. Now, hey, that's just last week's box score. One other matchup in which you should temper your expectation comes this Monday. Monday Night Football as the Kansas City Chiefs and that second-ranked fantasy defense against running backs hosts Alvin Kamara and the Saints. I'm not sure which fantasy defense against Alvin Kamara is better, the Kansas City Chiefs or Taysom Hill. With that being said, head over to RotoBaller.com for all the latest news and analysis, and make sure to check out those injury reports. And the best way to do that is heading over to the Discord channel, where you'll find me there 24/7. See you next week.